Hello everyone, welcome back to Karan Academy. My name is Karan, and today we're going to be talking about diverticular diseases. So the two main things we'll be talking about would be diverticulosis and diverticulitis. Now, these may seem relatively straightforward conditions, and I'm sure you know your buzzwords, but there are a few key differences which I think often are overlooked between the two, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So firstly, what are they and how are they different? I also want to preface this by saying that this lecture contains some of the worst pictures I've ever seen in my life. I absolutely hated this lecture, making it, recording it. I feel icky, and I'm sure you guys will relate in a few slides. So what is diverticulosis? So diverticulosis just means that there's an outpouching of the colonic mucosa. It's very common. 50% of those above the age of 60 have these. There are a lot of things that can cause this, but the way I like to think about it is that the colonic mucosa, like any other connective tissue, often can become weak with time. And when it becomes, if you have a weak mucosa coupled with excessive pressures, you get these outpouchings. So things like obesity, having a low GI diet. Why? Because this can lead to constipation, and with excessive straining, we are again increasing the pressure within that lumen, going to lead to outpouchings. IBD, because you have issues with the actual membrane itself and the mucosa becomes friable and thin, and then connective tissue disorders as well. Now, this can be either a true diverticuli or a pseudo diverticuli, depending on how many layers are affected. And here's what it looks like. So this is your normal colonic mucosa. If you have an outpouching that affects all layers, if it just affects the mucosa or the submucosa, then that's called a pseudodiverticulum. And a true diverticulum affects all layers. So how does diverticulosis present? Well, diverticulosis itself is usually inherently asymptomatic. Some symptoms can include abdominal pain, discomfort, a bit of bleeding. Now, why do you get the bleeding? If you go back to this picture, you notice how this entire membrane is very vascular, right? Makes sense. The colonic mucosa itself should be very vascular. And so when you have these outpouchings, it takes along with it some of the vessels. Now, these new vessels that are lining the internal surface of these outpouchings are going to be very weak, and these often break and bleed, which is why one of your differentials for lower GI bleeding is diverticulosis. When this presents with a whole other bunch of symptoms, you think this is diverticulitis. Now, what is diverticulitis and how is it different? This is diverticulosis, and I just hate this picture so much. I genuinely cannot explain how much I hate this picture. It is the worst. Now let's talk about diverticulitis and how diverticulitis is different. So you see how these outpouchings exist, right? As fecal matter passes through them, you can often have stool getting stuck in these openings. And as you can see, this is it's a one-way passage, right? There's no where for the stool to go outside of this. And once you have kind of stool in this area, combine that with the highly vascular membrane that can break, you now have a contact or a source between blood and stool. As you know, that's never good. And therefore, you can have spread of microbes through the bloodstream, causing that inflammatory process. And that is what diverticulitis is. Diverticulitis is the infective complication of diverticulosis. Now, if I ask you, random person watching this, are you likely to have bleeding with acute diverticulitis? I hope you would think to yourself, well, Karan, you just said that you have fecal matter stuck in here and that gets obstructed and infected, right? And if that is infected and obstructed, the bleeding vessels here are not going to leak into the colon and are not going to pass through, which is why bleeding is almost never seen with acute diverticulitis. But instead it presents with typically pain and discomfort in the left lower quadrant. It can also present with pain in the right lower quadrant, and that's more commonly seen in people of an East Asian background. And this is what those kind of fecal impactions look like. So once you have something stuck in there, it's blocked, so you're not going to have any bleeding, but it can get infected, and it can often seep into the bloodstream, and that is why diverticulitis is something that you need to treat quite aggressively. It's not something that you just kind of wait for it to get better. So how do we investigate them? So let's start with diverticulosis. As I said, most of them are going to be asymptomatic, potentially presenting with GI bleeding. Now, with any form of lower GI bleeding, you always want to do a colonoscopy and a gastroscopy. So a scope from either side. We want to manage diverticulosis conservatively. And as we said, we want to improve their diet to prevent further progression. So we want to get them on a high fiber diet, adequate hydration, control their IBD well, talk about stool softness, anything to prevent that increased pressure within the colon. Now, if you suspect acute diverticulitis, you should consider an infective screen. So FPE, UEC, LFT, CRP, blood cultures, all talked about. A CT abdomen with contrast is going to be your gold standard investigation. What is that going to show? You're going to see diverticular outpouchings. Excuse me, sorry. And as well as pericolic fat stranding. Now, across this lecture series, I've talked about fat stranding quite a bit. Now, what is fat stranding? Fat stranding is basically when you have inflammation in your abdomen, your fat is one of those key things that can kind of wrap around that infective source to try and contain it to the best of its ability. And that's something that the greater omentum does really well as well. However, as a complication of that, you're going to see that stranding next to whatever is inflamed. So with pancreatitis, you can see pancreatic fat stranding. You can see the same with cholecystitis, appendicitis, as well as diverticulitis. So with diverticulitis, it would make sense that you would get peri, meaning adjacent, colic next to the colon, fat stranding. And kind of this is what that image would look like. So as you can see here, there are these tiny outpouchings or diverticuli, and you can see there's quite a bit of inflammation around the colon itself, and that's the pericolic fat stranding. You would not be expected to read or interpret CTs at this point, so this is just for your reference, for you to have an idea of what it looks like. In terms of management, so if it's uncomplicated diverticulitis, just fluids, good analgesia, resting the bowel, and antibiotic therapy, which isn't always indicated. So you would go with metronidazole and ciprofloxacin. Also, sorry, this should be diverticulitis, not appendicitis. So if it's complicated, which means if there's a fever, if they're systematically unwell, hemodynamic instability, changes to bowel habits, if they have underlying comorbidities, we want to start them on broad spectrum IV antibiotics, as well as look out for some complications. So abscesses are a really big one. So with this, you can end up with a local collection that just sits there. And if it is less than 4 centimeters, you can manage that conservatively. Anything bigger than 4 should be usually surgically drained. And if there is a perforation, and again, I'm sure you're very familiar with the signs of perforation, you're going to have on clinical examination, signs of peritonism. So guarding, rigidity, they're going to be in a lot of pain. They can't move. You would also see or notice absent bowel sounds on clinical examination. On imaging, you would see a pneumoperitoneum, a football sign, air under the diaphragm. All of those would make you think, well, this is really out of bounds with what normal diverticulitis should be, and I suspect a perforation. In saying that, you are not going to know what the normal for acute diverticular pain is. I definitely don't. And I realize how it's a bit hard to make that clinical judgment. When is something out of bounds? Like, when is appendicitis pain normal appendicitis? When is it kind of perforated appendicitis pain? You don't know because you haven't seen enough appendicitis, and neither have I. And it's definitely something that we will learn with experience. But that's what I guess one of the signs. And apparently it's really, really obvious when you see 10 and then you see the 11th, that's very, very different to the earlier 10. And that's all we had for diverticular pathology. I hope that made sense. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to chuck me a message. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. And as always, please look after yourselves and please look after your loved ones.